All right, welcome back. What I'd like to go over today is the notes number 7, which have to do with zoning, which we're going to be covering, I think, in weeks 5 and week 6. And just get into a general discussion of that. Zoning, at its basic, is an attempt by state and local government to control how land is used. When people first arrived in North America, there was nothing here but the natives and their small settlements and a great deal of empty space and forest. And people basically moved out into the forest, out into the different open lands and did whatever they wanted. And that was generally the idea that if you owned a piece of property, you were free to do whatever you wanted to do with it. As time went on, as cities became bigger, as different industries began to develop, particularly industries such as large-scale slaughtering of animals in slaughterhouses, large factories that produced a great deal of water pollution, air pollution, created a lot of noise, that people began to realize that it may not be the best thing to let people just do whatever they want, wherever they want. And so there began, at the beginning of the 20th century, a movement to attempt to regulate how land could be used. And this was fought vehemently for a very long time. In Massachusetts, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts struck down zoning regulations enacted by the state at least twice, and eventually they had to amend the state constitution to allow for zoning to be considered constitutional by the Massachusetts court. In Rhode Island, most cities and towns did not enact zoning ordinances until almost the 1960s, and some of them even later than that. So that it is not really an old concept. It's been a long time in coming, and it took a long while to be accepted, and still a very hotly contested area. And there are attorneys who make a great deal of money representing clients in zoning matters. And it's a very interesting area of law at the same time. Now, one of the basic issues with zoning brings us back to constitutional law. The Fifth Amendment was very clear that there could be no taking of private property for any type of public use without just compensation. And when zoning initially came in, the courts at first looked at it as a taking. We're now telling people that they couldn't do certain things with their property. And therefore, they held it unconstitutional unless the states or the federal government were willing to pay for controlling the uses of the land. It took a while to get around that, but lawyers being lawyers, they came up with a theory that allowed that to happen. And the theory is something called pre-existing uses. So basically, when a zoning ordinance is passed or amended, the effect can only be prospective, which means it can only go into the future. It cannot be retrospective. It cannot control things that have already happened, that are already there. So that if you happen to have a service station where you sell gasoline, you repair cars, and that was legal at the time when you built that station, began that business, and then for some reason the municipality decides to change the zoning regulations to make this a residential area only, they cannot force you to leave unless they pay for whatever your loss is by leaving. So, particularly in places like Rhode Island, like the older cities in Massachusetts, when you drive around and look, it almost seems sometimes like zoning doesn't exist, and things seem very chaotic and that uses are mixed together in a hodgepodgey way. But a large part of that has to do with the fact that these cities were already 300 years old by the time zoning came into being, so large parts of them were developed, and large things, different things were where they were, and until the owners of that particular property decided, no, we're not going to use it for this anymore, even though it didn't meet the zoning, if they were a pre-existing, non-conforming use, then they're allowed to stay. Now, the whole idea of zoning, the reason we call it that, is what initially the idea was that we would take a city or a town or a county and we would split it into zones on the map. And we would say that all manufacturing has to be here, all agriculture has to be over there, all business uses will be in the center of town, and there will be residential 2 and 3 family areas, residential 1 family areas. So that basically you were taking a map and you were literally drawing zones on it and saying that in this particular square on the map, this particular zone, only certain uses would be allowed. So that's where the idea comes from. That's where the name comes from. We're going to see as we get further on into this talk that the idea of creating absolute zones is beginning to fall into disfavor a little bit, and some creative architects and urban planners are coming up with other ways to look at things, and have been very effective in the last 15 or 20 years in coming up with some other alternatives to just drawing blocks on the map and saying everybody in this block has to have a single family house and nothing else. An implicit taking would be if you zone property in such a way that the owner is left with no legal use for it. And at that point in time, the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment due process clause come into play, and the municipality trying to enforce that law would basically have to buy that property from the owner, so that you always have to leave an owner of property with some reasonable and productive use of their land. You cannot zone an entire area a bird sanctuary only, or a wetlands preservation area only, where no building is allowed and no uses are allowed. You cannot do that. You can limit uses quite substantially, but you cannot wipe out every valid use that an owner would have of their land. The courts consider that just another form of eminent domain. Eminent domain, I think we talked about it earlier, but if not, it is the idea that the state, local, and federal governments can take your land for public purposes if they so desire, but they must pay you reasonable fair value at the time of taking. So again, an implicit taking, if they were to leave you with no actual use of your land, then they have in effect handled that property as if they were using eminent domain, and the courts will say you have the right to be compensated. Now, zoning covers a number of different things. The most basic thing is use restrictions. So the most basic idea of zoning is we're telling people what can you do in certain areas of the town and not do in certain areas of town. To what use can you put the property? But another aspect of this that came in the 70s and 80s and 90s was an idea of density control. Very many people began to feel that cities were overcrowded, that it was not economically or socially good to have millions of people jammed into small areas. And so they also began to amend and adopt zoning ordinances so that the number of people living or working or using the land in a certain area would be limited. So zoning can control use, it can control density. In Rhode Island, in the 1990s, after watching cities and towns do all kinds of crazy zoning things over the years from the 1960s on, the state legislature finally got its act together and passed a comprehensive zoning and subdivision statute for the state. Under that statute, every city and town in Rhode Island has to come up with what's called a master plan, which is the creation of a zoning scheme for their entire town, listing every parcel of land, making it very clear what can be done and cannot be done on any particular piece of land. Once that has been done, the cities and towns who hold the basic power to amend zoning laws and regulations in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, they are prohibited by statute in Rhode Island from doing something called spot zoning. And spot zoning is where you create either a restriction of use or you allow a use in an area where it's not normally allowed. So where you basically take one lot, you say, oh, well, yes, this is a one-family residential area, but you can open a convenience store over here on this particular lot. Under the 1990s regulation statutes passed in Rhode Island, spot zoning became illegal, and the cities and towns have to come up with some kind of a master plan and follow it. And it's very interesting. In zoning, the courts have held, and the statutes have confirmed this now, that parties in interest are the neighbors, are anybody who will be affected by this change in the zoning. So that if you have a situation where you're asking to change the zoning, change the use for a particular piece of property, or where you get into an area where you may need a special exception, you must give in Rhode Island notice to abutters within 200 feet of the outermost boundaries of the piece of property you're dealing with, and they all have the right to come to a public hearing and to make their voices known as to whether they approve or don't approve of this. And of course, politicians and most zoning boards, sometimes it's the city council sitting as a zoning board, sometimes it's a separate board of people, but appointed by the city council and or the mayors in the cities and towns. They are political in nature. Politicians do not like having angry voters, having angry citizens. So very often, certain zoning projects that maybe even will be favored by the town government get shot down because enough people show up and demonstrate against it, speak against it, and make it clear they're not happy with what the zoning proposal is. Now, there are many situations, human life and topography, the shape and flow of the land being what it is, and again, particularly here in the Northeast, where we have been developing for nearly 400 years the use of land. Not every lot, not every parcel of land, not every piece of property fits neatly into the plan. And so there are situations where your piece of land may not be practical for what it is that's even allowed in the zone. Particularly when you think about as part of density control, some of the things that they include in the zoning regulations now are setbacks. You have to leave so many feet from the sideline of the property to the wall of the building, so many feet from the back of the property, so many feet from the front. You have to provide for parking spaces for X number of cars, depending on how many people are going to live in the building or how many units there are going to be. And very often there'll be parcels of land that are oddly shaped, that are undersized, and that's another, again, as part of density control. They strictly control the size of the lots that can be created at this point in time, but there are large numbers of pre-existing lots that were created, some even 200 years ago, that have not yet been built on, and when you go to build on them, you find out that this lot does not meet the minimum setback, square footage requirements, all that. In those situations, you can ask for something called a variance. And a variance means that we are looking at the zoning ordinance. We know we don't meet every single rule. Usually you have to meet the use. So again, you can't come in and say, I want to put in a nuclear waste site in a residential area. Can I have a variance? But if you're trying to build a house and the shape of your lot would leave the back of the house only 5 feet wide, if you followed the setback lines exactly, then you can come in and ask for a variance. Several things have to be proven. And again, you have to go through the whole public hearing process. You have to let your neighbors know within 200 feet. It is advertised in the paper, so anybody in town actually can show up and speak at the hearing. You have to show that there's an undue hardship to you, that you would not be able to build a house, that you would not be able to use the land unless this variance were granted. And then you also have to show that what you're going to do is in basic conformance with the zoning regulations. It will not hinder the value usefulness of the surrounding properties by your asking for a variance, asking for a special exception. All right, so, and I use the word special exception there, I shouldn't, because variance is one thing. It's basically asking for relief from the housekeeping provisions. How many feet do I have to be back from the road? How many feet of frontage do I need? How many square feet? How high can my building be? There are something called special exceptions. And special exceptions are a way in which, again, the cities and towns try to keep control of what's going on. If any of you are familiar with North Providence, if you drive from Centerdale down to the Pawtucket line, I call Mineral Spring Avenue a complete and total failure of urban planning and zoning. We have malls behind malls behind malls along what used to be basically a residential street. Traffic is horrific, congestion is horrific. It's almost eye pollution, the number of signs that you have to look at and see as you go by. Driving past all the various shops and establishments that have been allowed. But if you go in North Providence, you go up to High Service Avenue where Fatima Hospital is. When I was a child, there were all large houses along that street, fairly large houses, a very nice neighborhood, a well-to-do neighborhood. But because of the proximity to the hospital over the years, a number of those houses have been turned into doctors' offices and lawyers' offices and small clinics, treatment facilities. And in that situation, they had amended the zoning long ago to allow those residential buildings to be turned into doctors' and lawyers' offices. However, it can only be done by special exception. So that even though the zone says, yes, Mr. Walsh, you can buy a house on this street and you can turn it into a law office, you must still go before the zoning board, and they have the right to control certain things like hours, number of people who will be utilizing the property at any given time, parking spaces, signage, outside lighting. So again, it's an attempt to make sure that the other residential neighbors are not overburdened by what you're attempting to do, turning a residential property into a business, even though it's legal to do that. It allows them to have certain controls. And special exceptions are not grandfathered. So if I set up a law practice in one of those buildings and I have it for 25 years, and then when I'm ready to retire, I go to sell it to another attorney, and she wants to carry on her law office there, she cannot just move in and automatically presume she's good to go because I had a law office. The rule of special exceptions in Rhode Island says that she must still go back to the town and have a hearing and make sure that there are rules set down so that she uses the property in conformance with the way that the zoning board feels it should be used at that point. We had talked about non-conforming uses, right? And that's the idea that if your use existed before the zoning ordinance, the passing of the ordinance cannot make you give up your use. It can only say that you are already there, so you are allowed. The slang term for this, even that lawyers use, is that it is grandfathered, that it is in. Now, it's a very interesting thing that happens with grandfathered uses. Number one is the properties can become extremely valuable because let's say that you built a service station where you do auto repairs and you sell gasoline, and that was your great grandfather had started that in the 1920s when you were out in the country and surrounded by farm fields, and the town grew and moved out to you, and then zoning came in and said that the area where you are is supposed to be a residential one-family neighborhood. They can't make you leave. You have every right to stay. And one of the things that now happens is your property is very valuable because no other gas station, no other service station can be built in this neighborhood. So you basically, by virtue of the zoning and grandfathering, have a monopoly in this particular area. So these properties are watched and people buy them, and merchants and business people buy them and sell them all the time. Now, some of the things you need to know about grandfathering. Number one is if you are operating a use, engaging in a use that is grandfathered, you cannot expand or extend that use. So if you had a 2-bay service station that's grandfathered, it doesn't give you the right to put in a 3 or 4 or 5-bay service station. If you had a service station that when your grandfather and father had it, only repaired cars and sold gas, you cannot just say by way of grandfather, you cannot put a convenience store and a Dunkin' Donuts in there. The grandfathering says your grandfather to whatever existed at the time the zoning came in and nothing greater. That could even be extended to the point of what hours you were open. If you went back 30 or 40 years ago, most places were not open 24/7, 365. So you also have to be very careful if you're thinking of taking on a business that's in a grandfathered situation, because while it can be very profitable, it can also be very controlled by the city or the municipality. They can stick their nose and say, no, you put up that extra gas pump, you're going too far. Oh, you want to put up an electric charging post? Nope, that wasn't what you had there before. You can't do it. Now, the other reality about grandfathering is that once you give up the use, it is gone. So that if you stop using the property, in my example, as a service station, then the grandfathering disappears, and at some point you're going to have to tear down the service station buildings and let that be turned into a lot for a one-family house, or a couple of lots for one-family houses, if that's what your neighborhood says. There have been some great court cases over that in situations where by fire or storm, or out on the West Coast by earthquake, certain businesses have been put out of business for a year or two by circumstances, and then the cities and towns trying to claim that, oh, you had to stop the use, so therefore you cannot go back and use it for that. Most courts have now come to the decision, in some states by statute, that as long as your intent is to rebuild and to reopen, and that you do that within a reasonable time. Within Rhode Island, it's very hard to pin down a definitive rule, but most of the cities and towns operate on a 1-year type rule. If you get the business up and going again within a year, they're not going to give you any issue. But if the buildings lie dormant longer than that, then they could say the grandfathering is gone and you have to now revert the use of that land to whatever the surrounding zone is. Of late, a lot of discussion has gone into, and there's been a lot of work done by the cities and towns, and even the cities, the inner cities like Providence, and that, with something called cluster zoning. Cluster zoning is basically where, in traditional subdivisions going back over 100 years, and right up into the 70s and 80s, you had a piece of land, 20 acres, you divided that up into 20 square house lots, you put a road in to connect them all to the main road, and every house sat on there 1 little acre of land. You ended up with 20 acres of lawns, and with usually a very long road to maintain. And what traditionally would happen, though it happens less and less now, is that once a subdivision was established, the utilities, the road, the water pipes, the sewer pipes would be turned over to the town, and the town would have to maintain them. As part of the environmental movement, beginning in the 1990s, there several architects and city planners came up with the idea of cluster zoning, which is, if we have a 30-acre or 20-acre parcel of land, we try and put all the buildings, we try to group them fairly close together, and then leave a large area of open space around them. And what this does is, number one, it lessens the amount of roads, the amount of utilities that need to be run, and it stops a large area of the parcel from being turned into lawns. And in many cases, particularly if you're outside the cities, you're in some of the suburban towns, it's a way out of 30 acres to still get in 15 or 20 houses, but preserve 20 acres of woodlands. This has become very popular. Some towns have actually adopted ordinance saying that any new subdivision has to work on some type of a cluster model where there will be some type of space left that is not developed. And generally what happens with this space is it is held almost in a condominium type way. All of the people in the subdivision own it together, but there are restrictions which say it can never be developed, it can never be split up, it must be left natural in most cases. All right, exclusionary zoning, otherwise called snob zoning. Many cities and towns trying to prevent lower income people from moving in. This was particularly true in the late 60s, 70s, early 80s. They passed rules. Some of the suburban towns of Rhode Island have rules even now that say you must have a 5-acre piece of land to build a house on. 5 acres in Rhode Island is outrageously expensive. You're looking at several $100,000 just for the dirt before you put in a septic system, before you drill your well, before you put your foundation in. So in effect, by having ordinances like this, other types of ordinances like this are saying that there is a minimum house size. So you have to have a certain number of square feet. You have to have a certain number of garages. You have to leave a certain area of land as open space around the house. They all make the purchasing and build of property and the building of residences far more expensive than it would otherwise be. A number of lawsuits were brought in the federal courts, even all the way up to the Supreme Court, trying to challenge these. And the Supreme Court has basically said, unless you can prove that this was done specifically for racial or ethnic purposes to keep certain types of people out, it's okay to keep poor people out, but as long as you're not doing it violating one of the suspect classes under the 14th Amendment rules and the civil rights rules that we now have. When you take a big piece of land and you divide it into smaller pieces of land, that's called a subdivision. In Rhode Island, as we said, beginning in the 1990s, the state passed a statute so that subdivisions are completely regulated. It's left up to the local cities and towns to develop plans and to enforce them. But the statute did develop certain things, and there are basically three types of subdivisions. There are administrative subdivisions. In an administrative subdivision, you're not creating any particular new lots, you're changing boundaries. I've done several of these in the past few years where neighbors have done things like there was, I had one set where there was a very skinny piece of land that went from one neighbor's yard and ran 50 feet behind the other neighbor's yard. And it was like 15 feet wide. There was nothing you could do with it. The neighbor whose land it ran behind thought it'd be advantageous to add it to their property. We had to go again before the planner, town planner. We had to get a surveyor to draw up the plans. But so long as we were not creating new lots, we were just changing the boundaries. Another situation I had was where folks put up a shed, and they had two fairly large pieces of property where the boundary lines had never been clearly set out, and the shed ended up 10 feet over on the other person's land. The person who owned the shed had been using all this land for years. The other person actually thought the person with the shed owned it. When it came to light that this is what happened again, they wanted to adjust the boundary. You can do that with an administrative subdivision. It does not require notice to the neighbors. It does not require a hearing. It just requires that a surveyor draw up your plans, and those plans have to conform to the zoning, conform to the subdivision regulations. If they don't conform, then you have to have a hearing. You have to go and ask for a variance. A minor subdivision creates 5 or fewer lots, and there's somewhat of an expedited process for creating minor subdivisions, but they do have to be advertised. You have to have a hearing. A major subdivision is anything that creates more than 5 lots. And in that type of situation, you have to go through the whole process of submitting plans. Many towns now have pre-hearing meetings that are required so that your architects, your engineers, your surveyor are going to have to show up, and you're going to have to argue with first the planner, then with people unofficially on the zoning and subdivision boards, and then you're going to have hearings on them. So a major subdivision is a fairly expensive undertaking at this point, and it can be very frustrating. I've represented a couple of clients in the last few years where we've had to go to 6 or 7 public hearings to get very simple things done. So it does become an interesting thing and an expensive thing. The more that you have to spend to subdivide the property and to get it set up, the more you're going to have to charge for whatever you build on it when you go to sell it. All right. What else? Many towns have now created something called an impact fee, so that when you're about to build a new building, new residence even, you have to pay a set amount of money to the municipality on the idea that they are going to have to tie you into the sewer, the water system. They're going to have to maintain the road, possibly the sidewalk forever, and that therefore part of the development cost should go to the town to compensate them. Some of the things, when you're buying a lot of land that is not already built on, one thing you want to make sure is that it's what we call buildable. Now, this is not a term that's actually in the law, but it is a term that is common in the industry. And the idea is a buildable lot means that you can use it for its intended purpose. It meets all the zoning and subdivision requirements without having to go through the hearing process. Some of the things that they look at, as we said, sidelines, backlines, height restrictions, frontage. Every town and city has requirements for there has to be a minimum number of feet where the property touches a public road or street, and that is called frontage. And again, if you don't have the minimum number of feet, you will not be allowed to build. One of the things that comes into play more and more, again, as people are redefining their ideas of zoning and their ideas of development and what's good or bad, is the idea of mixed use. From the early 20th century right up into the 1990s, the idea was we keep all residences over here, we keep all stores over there, we keep businesses over here. Again, the idea of zones, which created the suburbs that we have now, where sometimes, my parents for 50 years have owned a house out in Cumberland in a subdivision that was built 50 years ago. And they are 4 miles from the nearest gas station, the nearest store that sells a loaf of bread. It means you have to use the automobile for everything. There's no, even when we went to school, the school was 3 miles away. And people began to say, why are our cities and towns, why are they not like Europe? Why are they not like other places in the world? And one of the things that the planners discovered is that in most parts of the world, people still live in mixed use neighborhoods. You have residences, you have little stores, you have restaurants, you have churches, you have schools, all within the neighborhoods. And for many, many people, particularly in Europe and in South America, the large majority of things that they do within their life are within walking distance of their houses. And that gives a whole different atmosphere to life. You get to know who your neighbors are. You walk twice a week down to the store to buy groceries, and you bring them back to your house in a cart. You get to see people, talk to people. There's a whole different ambiance than just driving miles in your car. And in some cases, I have no idea who lives on either side of my parents at this point in time. And they have each couple has lived there for years, but they get up in the morning, go to work in Boston. They drive in their cars to do everything. There's no occasion to even see them, talk to them, even know who they are. So mixed use is becoming much, much more common, much more prevalent. There are several communities down in South County now that have been built from scratch, and they basically are on a mixed use idea, which is that they start out with a center where there are shops and restaurants and small stores, sometimes dentist offices, doctor's offices, other accountants, other professional offices. Then around that are townhouses that are built kind of condominium style, where you have a number of units in one building. And then further out from that, you get into duplexes and single family houses, but all built around a created center that has a lot of the amenities and facilities that make life interesting and pleasant, and allows you to walk to these things if you choose to. Several years ago, my wife and I spent a week in Williamsburg, Virginia, and we went to visit the old colonial part of Williamsburg, which is a wonderful thing if you're into history and the American Revolution at all. It's an incredible place to see. And not far down the road from Williamsburg town is the Jamestown settlement, where the first English arrived to build a permanent settlement in Virginia. Very interesting. But several miles outside of colonial Williamsburg is what they call Newtown. And they actually did, going back in the late 90s and early 2000s, they built a town which probably has 5,000 or 6,000 people in it on this idea. And we went there one day and spent the day, and it was very pleasant. It was very much like being almost like at a big theme park. There was a center hub where there were stores and restaurants and theaters and convenience places, actually even a supermarket. And then there were residences in concentric circles going further and further out. So the zoning, after being static for many years, is developing. Many changes are coming about. New ideas are coming into play. Some of the things in Providence and Pawtucket, they have changed the zoning so that many of the old mill buildings, which are now historic structures that were looked upon as eyesores 50 years ago, but now are looked upon as part of the history, that they're now allowing those industrial areas to be redistricted as artist districts, as residential areas, building loft apartments in these things. Brown University has set up a medical zoning area around the electric company on Eddy Street, where a number of the old mill buildings have been turned into research and medical facilities. So there is a constant growing body of ideas about what zoning should be, how it should happen, how things should go. Very interesting thing to work in if you're ever working in the law. Certainly many people go to school to become city planners and that, and it can be a fascinating area. We talked about variances, historic zoning. Rhode Island is in the forefront of the whole movement to protect historic dwellings. If any of you are familiar with Benefit Street in Providence, if you start at one end at Wicked Inn and come up all the way up to North Main Street where University Heights Shopping Center is, you'll go past 300 years worth of residences. And you can almost see how the city developed over the centuries. And most of those buildings have now, at least the exteriors, have been restored to what they were when they first built. And it's just an incredible experience. You feel like you're walking through history. That almost did not happen. In the 1950s and 60s, that area of Providence was completely run down, had been completely neglected for many years. The Great Depression and the war were not good on Providence, and the economy never really recovered. And they were beginning to tear down many of these historic structures. The whole area where Moshassuck Square in Providence, where the Marriott Hotel is, and where the, I think it's ABC Studios, and those condominiums along the river there, they were all houses when I was a child, and they were flattened because they were deemed to be of no value and not rehabable and that. Well, in the late 1950s, a woman named Antoinette Dowling, who was fairly wealthy, lived on the east side, but up on the higher part of the east side, on the other side of Brown, where it was still quite prestigious and the houses were very valuable. She saw Benefit Street, and she realized that many of these houses were built before the Revolutionary War. They were several hundred years old. And she purchased one and began to rehab it and began a movement to do that. And she basically saved that part of Providence from destruction and brought it back to what it had originally been. And now is a tremendous tourist attraction. If you walk along Benefit Street in the summer, I challenge you to listen to the accents of the people who are walking on the street observing, and they'll be from all over the country and sometimes from all over the world. They come to see this. And the same thing took off about the same time in Newport. Newport has one of the largest collections of 17th and 18th century buildings in North America. And by instituting historic zoning, they've been able to preserve those buildings and to preserve a large chunk of the historic aspect of Newport. And that's one of the things that draws tourists there, as well as the ocean and the ships and the shopping and the mansions, and even the mansions. There was a period of time in the 1950s and early 1960s where most of the mansions had been abandoned. The people who built them, it was now the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who built them who were inheriting them. They didn't want to pay the taxes. They didn't want to pay the upkeep. A couple of them were torn down, and then the city began an effort to try and save them. The Historical Society was created to raise money and try and operate them at a profit so that they could protect them and preserve them. And there was a great deal of time and effort went into this. And I said, Rhode Island was one of the forefront of places to do this. And it was kind of a strange thing. The fact that the economy was so bad here in the 60s and early 70s, it saved Providence from what happened to a lot of other cities because we were just too poor to tear things down and certainly too poor to build anything new. So there was no motivation to tear things down. If you go to Boston and you go to Boston City Hall and you stand on that humongous plaza that in the winter, the wind blows up from the ocean so badly it'll blow you over and it'll give you wind chill 50 degrees lower than whatever the temperature is. And you look at the massive 1970s brick and concrete architecture all around there. That area used to be called Scully Square 50 years ago. It was a very vibrant neighborhood, had been originally an old Yankee neighborhood and then became an Irish neighborhood. And the city, with their grand ideas in the 1970s, basically leveled 20 or 30 blocks of downtown and all the shops and buildings, all of which, again, were very old, very European in nature, leveled them and came up with that hideous city hall and the square that surrounds it. Thank God Quincy Market was not destroyed in that, but it came very close to being torn down in the colonial buildings on either side of Quincy Market. So again, Providence had no money for such grand schemes in those days, so our historic buildings tended to sit there, somewhat neglected and poverty-stricken, but then as the 1980s and 90s and the 2000s came along, there was a great movement to restore those buildings. In a historic district. And that was a very interesting concept too. Again, telling somebody they have to keep their house looking like it looked in 1798 is somewhat of a burdensome restriction. And it was fought. It was fought by a number of different developers in different states. And the major case that settled all this was Grand Central Station in the heart of New York City. Was built in the 1800s. It's a very ornate building, and the Pan American Company had bought it somewhere in the 1970s and had every intention of tearing it down, putting in a new basement station like it's under Madison Square Garden now, and basically obliterating the entire historic station. A group of New Yorkers got together, the city passed ordinances, the state passed legislation saying this is historic, you can't do this, the city has a right to preserve cultural aspects, cultural elements, and they fought it all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States saying that that was an illegal taking and the city would have to pay them for the building. And the court ruled in favor of the cities and basically said historic zoning is permissible within limits, it can exist. Now, again, if you are the owner of a house within a historic district, and all of the east side of Providence is now a historic district, the Armory is a historic district. I don't know, they were talking about making some parts of the North End historic. But I don't know that that has gone through. I haven't read anything on that recently, so I suspect it has not. But if you own a house in a historic district, besides going through all the regular zoning processes when you want to do something, you must also go before the historic zoning or the historic district committee, and they do things even to the point of controlling the colors that you can paint your house, controlling how the exterior of the house is going to look, controlling what the driveway material is going to be, all in the efforts to keep these buildings looking as they did in the olden times, looking as they did when they were originally built. And it can be very expensive and very frustrating. It is far more expensive to have new windows built with wooden mullions, which are the little slats between the glass, and wooden window sashes, than it is to buy the plastic window replacement windows that 99% of us now have in our houses. If you're in a historic district, you cannot put plastic windows in your house. You must follow the rules that have been set by the commission to keep the house looking the way it looked 200 or 300 years ago, sometimes in Providence. So it still is a point of contention. People every now and then do make it into the newspapers when they're fighting the historic district, but it is a reality. It is here. I suspect most Rhode Islanders would not want to see Benefit Street torn down. They would not want to see Newport raised to build Las Vegas-style hotels. So there is very little impetus to change the historic zoning and districting that we now have. And as a matter of fact, little by little, more and more towns have adopted historic areas and put historic regulations in for different neighborhoods within them. Besides zoning, there are a whole bunch of other regulations that the state and local governments can impose on a property owner. And again, I want to get back to the idea of the pickup sticks, holding all the sticks in your hand, and you can pull certain amount of sticks representing all the rights attached to a piece of property. There are health regulations. There are electric codes, plumbing codes, engineering codes, lead paint controls, asbestos controls, fire system controls, going to the extent in some places of requiring sprinkler systems in buildings, and certainly requiring alarms, carbon monoxide alarms. There's just a whole slew of regulations that you must follow now when you're building or remodeling or doing anything with a structure. And those are all rights that the state or the town have pulled out of your ownership of the building or your ownership of the property. One thing to remember, while there is the whole idea of pre-existing non-conforming use for zoning, because these regulations concern health and safety, the Supreme Court has said that they are part of the police powers of the state that the state had under the original Constitution, and which were only affirmed under the 14th Amendment, and that as long as the state is acting in a reasonable manner, they can impose ever tighter and ever newer health and safety restrictions, and you must conform with them. When I was a child, there was still properties in Providence where the people had to use an outhouse in the backyard to go to the bathroom. The houses did not have running water. They did not have flush toilets. That is totally, completely forbidden today. You could not rent an apartment to anyone. You could not even live in your own house in any of the municipalities in Rhode Island without having your own indoor plumbing and a sanitary disposal system, either through the public sewers or by some system built in your backyard to dispose of the waste. So that is an example of just some of the requirements that have been imposed upon people. You could not do off-grid homesteading in any town in Rhode Island that I can think of at this point, because again, you are required. If you are living in the property, if you are having tenants in the property, it is required that you have plumbing, it is required that you have electrical service, and the courts have been very lenient with cities and towns in saying, yes, you can impose these things. If you look at the last page of this section, it just gives you an idea of the various codes that apply to land and to building and to houses and to subdivisions at this point in time. It is extensive. And Rhode Island is far from the most restrictive state in these things. Massachusetts is far worse, and my rumor has it places like California and some of the other states with very big cities, New York, are outrageously restrictive in all the rules and regulations you have to follow to build, to renew, or even to just maintain a property. A couple of last things. DEM, the Department of Environmental Management. In Rhode Island, we normally think of them as the people who handle the state forests and the parks and animal type things and all that happy stuff, which they do. But two of the things that they have control of. One is they control wetlands in Rhode Island. And then there is a basic law now in Rhode Island, it's been here since the 1970s, that says you cannot build and you cannot develop wetlands. They must remain in their natural state. And it is basically DEM that determines what is a wetland, what can and cannot be done next to a wetland. The basic rule is within 200 feet of any designated wetland, you are restricted in what you can do and what can happen there. And wetlands can be a very, very confusing idea, because sometimes there doesn't have to be actual water on the land. There doesn't have to be a running stream. It doesn't have to be adjacent to the ocean. Sometimes, depending on the soil content, sometimes depending on the plants, they will determine that something is a wetland, even though there's not visible water on the surface. So if you are building on new lots, that always becomes an issue of finding out, are there any wetlands, and how do they restrict where you can put things on the lot, what you can do with the lot. The other thing that they control is, and I still have the old term there, an individual sanitary disposal system. If you are not on one of the municipal sewer systems in the state, then you must have your own system in your yard.